through the room, but I will sit next to the microphone. So with Remy, we had decided to do this event. Our idea was to bring more awareness and discussion from the Sahel, on the Sahel, the situation in the Sahel, in New York, and mixing the two ecosystems, if I might say, the UN ecosystem, which is very international, and also the New York ecosystem, which is also very international, but in a different way. In New York, you have some companies, private sector, think tanks, journalists interested or not on Africa, but with a potential interest. And we thought it would be good to mix the two, to have actually a discussion on this different perspective. We thought that instead of having only a political and security discussion on the Sahel, it would be also interesting to bring the focus, first on the context, the political and security situation, and two, really to focus on the fight against climate, the effects of climate change, desertification, and notably the project of the Great Green Wall. And we have a wonderful privilege to have Claude Gruditsky, who has produced a documentary, well-known documentary on this Great Green Wall, which has been a good tell us about the documentary. And we're going also to, before the second panel, we're going to watch some extract of your wonderful documentary. And as you know, this project of the Great Green Wall is a priority, an international priority for the Sahel, priority also for my country, France, who has been advocating for it, and priority for the Convention against on desertification, and we are very happy to have also high representative of the Convention with us today. I'm also, and I really would like to mention our guest of honor, who is Jimmy Adoum. Jimmy Adoum is the high representative of the Coalition Sahel. The Coalition Sahel was put in place about 3 years ago to enforce the international efforts on the Sahel, on different pillars, different perspectives, security, political development, and putting together the Sahelian countries, and you are from the Sahel, Mr. Adoum, and also the international partners of the Sahel. This is the same spirit that we have organized the conference today to bring, to increase even the partnership and the awareness here at New York level. I will just ending with mentioning all our partners. I mentioned already SOS Sahel and our mission to the UN, but I also, of course, want to mention the Sciences Po American Foundation. We have been a great partner in putting in place this conference, and also Columbia, because we have a partnership with the University of Columbia. And I think this is it in terms of the partners with which we organize this conference. I'm going to give the floor to Olivier Richard, my colleague from the French UN mission to the UN. But before that, I once again want to welcome you to the French Consulate and to wish you a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to everybody, and allow me first to thank very much Jeremy to host this event in this very beautiful room. As Jeremy said, I mean, the idea of this event was born a few months ago when my team and myself met with SOS Sahel, and I know that SOS Sahel had just met Jeremy as well, and we came to the conclusion that West Africa and the Sahel were not enough visible within the UN, and I understand that this is the same in the New York ecosystem. And so we had the idea to organize an event to give this opportunity to the UN and to New York to hear more about West Africa. My key message tonight is very simple, in fact. It's just the idea that collective mobilization can scale up action and can increase the impact of our initiatives on the field. And I think that the history behind the Great Green Wall is an example of what collective action can do. Because in fact, I mean, this Great Green Wall was a dream in the 80s, and it was launched by 11 African countries in 2007. But then, I mean, there were many challenges, many obstacles, and those 11 African countries took the opportunity offered by the One Planet Summit, organized by France, the UN, and the World Bank in January 2021, to launch a Great Green Wall accelerator. And through this accelerator, we managed to have many pledges, $16 billion for this project. So this is an example of what we can achieve together, and for France, most important is to achieve that with African partners, and that's the reason why it's very important for us to work with African partners. And I have the feeling that at the French mission to the UN, we can do even more in terms of cooperating with African mission, and I'm happy to have African mission tonight. But when I speak about collective mobilization from a French perspective, I also think of the European Union, you know, because for us it's very important, and to the African Union as well. And I would like to mention the European Union African Union Summit, which took place last February, which launched new initiative, and there's a very important one, which is in French, this is protein végétal, so I think in English this is plant protein crops. It's a bit difficult to translate, which is a new initiative, very important. We want to promote with the African Union, and I know that many West African countries want to be champions on this initiative. But as you know today, there have never been so many people in food insecurity in the world. So that's very bad. And I know that in the upcoming 3 months, we expect 18 million people in West Africa facing severe food insecurity. That's the reason why, I mean, the Great Green Wall, the plant protein crops and so on are not enough today, and we had to launch new initiative, and we welcomed the initiative by the Secretary General of the UN to set up a global crisis response group on food, energy and finance. This is a very important initiative, and in the same spirit, France, in its capacity of chair of the Council of the European Union, set up an initiative which is called FARM. This is Food Agriculture Resilience Mechanism, to support, you know, and to try to fight against food insecurity. So this is about solidarity, so to make sure that vulnerable countries have access to food. This is also about sustainable production, and to help especially African countries to increase their production, but respecting, you know, the Agenda 2030. And this is also about making sure that the markets are still open and transparent. You know, no restriction on export and so on, because it would be very bad for the access to the crops. Yes, so I didn't want to be too long, and now I think this is the time for me to give the floor to Mr. Adli. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think I can say a lot more than what has already been said, but I put bring on me saying that I'm the keynote speaker, so you never know what's going to happen tonight. But what we'll try to do is, to the extent that we can, take up the opportunity of these few minutes to share with you what we think is happening in our neighborhoods, and the extent to which individually and collectively, if we put together our forces, we should be able to rise up to the challenge and get a lot of good things done. With that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to stand before you here today. First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for having organized this important event, and I really seriously mean it. This is important event. Issues in Ukraine are dominating headlines these days, but as you know, they are not totally disconnected from what is happening in the Sahel. I came to New York on Monday to attend the Security Council meeting that dealt with the renewal of the mandate of the United Nations mission in Mali. Mali is, as you have known for 10 years, the epicenter of the torments that affect my region, I say so. The Consulate General of France, for here, to whom I owe this invitation, is well blessed to know this, having served as an African advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of a country that shares a deep connection with the Sahel. To put it very clearly, what has really changed recently is the eruption of global geopolitical tensions in the Sahel. And I saw it again in the Security Council on Monday. I was there when they were discussing those issues. Indeed, 10 years ago we were focused on issues of stabilization, the fight against terrorism, and of course development. Today, those issues must be managed in a context where Russia is not politically aligned with the other partners. I didn't want to tire you out too much, so I'm going to try to give you a very brief overview of the major challenges driving my mission as a High Representative. First of all, what is the coalition for the Sahel? Certainly some of you may have heard it, others have not. So I'll just take the opportunity to say a few things about the coalition for the Sahel. It is an initiative that brings together 60 states and organizations. Its core is made up of the Sahelian countries. It goes from Washington to Tokyo and from Stockholm to Accra. My job is to advocate for the political priorities put forward by Sahelian countries and their partners across the spectrum from security to development. What are those priorities right now? I'll name a few, three namely. First is political. That is what I have already discussed in the introduction, namely the ongoing reorganization of collective action linked to Mali's political misalignment. You know that Mali's junta is engaged in a showdown with the regional organizations, namely ECOWAS, and has decided to be much less cooperative with the United Nations and the other international partners involved in security and development. Another political challenge is to take into account the gradual but certain shift of terrorist groups toward the coastal countries. The parentheses used to be just Sahelian issues, nowadays it's shifted into coastal countries. In the background in the Sahel, as in many African countries, there is also disinformation, which is a war that does not say its name. We are no longer talking about diversity of opinion, but clearly about trout farms and agriculture that we had hardly seen since the Cold War. The second challenge, which is linked, is human insecurity. First, in terms of human rights, I met on Monday with the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Civilian populations are victims of massive and increasing abuses, not only by terrorist groups, but also by the armed forces and militias. On this last point, the United Nations is trying to investigate. Another challenge for human security is the major food crisis. To put it simply, the region's two top grain suppliers are Russia and Ukraine. Sahelian countries import 55% of their food. Parentheses. This too must stop. We have sufficient land. We need to find water. We need to find science, technology applied. And we have technology that have worked with the scale up and out. Let me take care of this issue. 20 out of the 80 million Sahelians are dependent on international food aid, and the figure is growing rapidly, as you all know. I would like to thank the partners, in particular the host country, for their emergency assistance. The third challenge, which will be addressed by one of the panelists today, is to work on the long term, which is to say on the root causes of the instability. And I could talk about several topics, but I would like to focus on only one of them, the agricultural challenge. 80% of Sahelians live in the countryside or make their living from agriculture. The population of the Sahel will double within 25 years. At the same time, the median climate change scenario predicts a temperature rise of 1.5 to 2 degrees, and this will cause agricultural yield to drop significantly if nothing is done. A good mathematician will probably tell you that the means pressure and resources will be multiplied by 4. I will let you imagine the massive destabilization in the West African region under these conditions. But there are solutions, and my good friend sitting right here is leading SOS Sahel, SOS International, and among others, among you are people who are engaged in those kind of experiences, and we have generally about good science, good technologies. We need to now scale back. They will certainly talk about that. So these solutions, not least of which is the Green Wall, Great Wall. Its ambition is not merely to create a hedge of acacia from Nouakchott to Khartoum, but to reclaim agricultural land on the savannah and also in the desert. The challenge is to expand agroecological practices massively. We master them very well because they are ancestral. Modern technologies can improve them further. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Sahel, I promise not to speak too long, but I've already done so for too long. So let's try, therefore, to pass the floor back to the organizer for the first panel. But allow me, at least last word, to pay tribute to the countries where I studied, meaning the US, the same country that practically invented the notion of think tank, and where civil society is vital. Standing here with you, I know that my message will find certainly a sounding board. And thank you for the honor to address such a distinguished audience tonight. Have a very pleasant evening, and may the force be with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adoum. This is a very strong testimony from somebody who has been a minister in the country, Chad, Minister of Agriculture. You have been also at the head of an organization put together the resources in terms of agriculture and Untitled Chapter for all the Sahel countries. Now inviting the panelists of the first panel, including Mr. Adoum, to take a seat here under the moderation of Ina Hoffman.
Hello. Excellent. Good evening, distinguished guests. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this very first panel of this conference. We have imminent panel of distinguished speakers. And my name is Lina Koli Hoffman. I'm an Associate Fellow of the African Program at Chatham House. I also lead the research on social norms and accountable governance. I also do a bit of work in food security in the Sahel. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really, I think very fortunate to be moderating this session. Our session this evening is oriented to discuss the issues of security. Dr. Adam already highlighted a lot of these issues around climate, population, and socioeconomic dynamics of the Sahel. And as you already began to expound for us this evening as well, the comments from Jeremy and Olivier, a lot of these dynamics are very much interconnected. So we see really interconnected vulnerabilities for the region. And as Dr. Adam was speaking, we are aware, very much starkly aware of the impact of climate variability and its negative impact on livelihoods in the region, on migration trends, as well as on social harmony. In many communities across the region, we are seeing a lot of intercommunal conflict and tensions, already political stability. We've spoken about Mali, highlighted that already, and as well on the GDP of many Sahelian countries. We've also seen a lot of escalating violence being driven by different socio-economic and political, as well as cultural factors. And as we've already heard this evening, a lot of these conflicts have not responded very well to military intervention, and whether it's domestic or multinational joint task forces, and as well as foreign forces. Instead, these interventions have exacerbated in a number of instances, feelings of injustice and exclusion, and as well contributed to the justice deficit, and as well the human rights abuse burden of a lot of countries in this region. And it is, you can't overemphasize the human abuse burden in the region, going back to over a decade now, for example, of the Boko Haram insurgency in northeast Nigeria that's spread across so many borders. And it's likely that many of these underlying causes, a lot of these underlying causes of these insecurities are going to persist or be with us for for a number of years at least, persisting in their impact on vulnerable populations, many of the poorest people in the world. And it's worth highlighting the impact on the Sahelian women, in particular, who bear a disproportionate burden in terms of reproductive labor, livelihood losses, violence and displacement. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to how these interconnected vulnerabilities will develop. So to help us understand the trajectory of these dynamics in the short, medium and long term, we have a brilliant panel of speakers. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lisa Anderson on our left. She's the James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Adum, here to my immediate left, the High Representative of the Coalition for the Sahel, and as well Mr. Remy Henrik, who is the Executive Director of SOS Sahel. So just to begin our discussion, I would like to ask Lisa the first question, and I want us to begin with a conversation around youth and the young population of the Sahel. The Sahel is predominantly young. 60% of the population is under 25 years of age. and the number of young people aged 15 to 24 is expected to continue to rise until 2025. So many of these young people lack employment opportunities and the chance to realize their potential. Lisa, could you just speak to us about what you think the socio-political consequences of this unrealized potential in the region and the implications of having such a large young population in the Sahel?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Let me perhaps start with a personal anecdote. I was the president of the American University in Cairo in 2011, and we saw what young people can do when they're really angry. And they were really angry in Tunisia, and they were really angry in Egypt and Libya and so forth. And I think the fact that that anger was expressed the way it was, brought down governments and so forth, and yet has left much of the Middle East and North Africa either in basically unresolved civil conflict, look at Libya, or increasingly autocratic governments, look at Tunisia these days, as well as Egypt and so forth, suggests that angry young people can bring things down, but they can't necessarily build things. And that's what I think we really have to be worrying about. So the average, the median age in the United States is 38, in France it's 42, I looked this up, in the Sahel it's 16. So that means that half the people are under 16. We're going to be living with these generations for longer, I think, than actually the next couple of decades. And they are going to be growing up in a world where there are no prospects. There aren't jobs, there's no real labor market, there's no future that they can imagine themselves having, because perhaps one or two of them can do whatever it is their parents were doing, but all the rest of them can't. And historically we've known that these kinds of population booms have led to migration. That's most of the people who came to the United States were the second son or the third son, or somebody from Europe who couldn't actually do what their parents did. So we know that this is, a recipe for migration, out-migration, if there's nothing to do. So we can assume that that will be part of what we look for. We can assume that spilling from Libya for the moment, a lot of the arms and conflict and so forth will continue to bleed into the Sahel. This is clearly something that, if there's nothing else to do, you can join a militia, or you can join a, revolutionary group or something like that, and at least you have some friends and you have a sense of belonging and so forth and so on. So I think some of what we're seeing, there doesn't seem to be any turning point to that for the foreseeable future. So I think, from the perspective broadly of Northern Africa and the Sahel, I think we have at least a generation in which we think unemployment will continue, and unemployed people will either leave or find something to occupy themselves that we wouldn't think of as particularly constructive. So I hope I am the most pessimistic person in the room, because I am actually pretty pessimistic. And I just want to say one thing, if I may, particularly in light of the comments about Mali these days. One of the things that a very wise think tank analyst has said about most of the governments of the Middle East and North Africa about 20 years ago, before, in other words, the Arab Spring, is that these countries had no greater enemy than their own governments. And that, I think, is also true. So when you think about, kind of what the international community should be doing, trying to stabilize and rebuild governments that are actually not working in the interests of their own citizens may not be what we ought to be doing.
I think you are not the only pessimistic person in the room. You mentioned the role of government, and I think that's a really important point to highlight. And I know, Jim, I didn't send you this question ahead, but I think it's important to speak about the role of government and the role of government institutions as hollowed out as we know that they are. There is the component of this discussion around the resources that governments have available for providing basic social services to the region. We know we're going to come to talking about the humanitarian situation, the emergency situation, but I do want to hear from your perspective. You have your background as the minister, Chadian Minister of Agriculture, all of these difficult decisions that governments have, put aside, you can't put aside corruption, mismanagement, low revenue and all of that. But I do want to hear from you, what are the trade-offs that governments have to grapple with to make decisions for providing basic social services for growing populations? Because it is really the role of government and the absence of government that's a huge component as to why we have this much vulnerability and hopelessness in the region. So what do governments, what are these trade-offs, what are these difficult decisions that governments have to make with very, very little resources from aid and revenue?
Well, I thought what I should have done is as soon as I finished that speech, ran out. So I don't want to be part of any of this, but no, we can't do that. We need to step up to the plate. We need to face up to those challenges. So let me look a little bit what she said with respect to the youth, because that's a very, very key component. Statistics available today show that at a minimum, Africa-wide, they graduate 32 million kids, at least bachelor's annually. And follow my. So if you take 32 million, you divide it by 54. And even if we are very generous, and some countries graduate about 200,000, others 500,000, so on and so forth. Keep in mind that no single government has been able to create 10,000 jobs consistently throughout the year. So if you do the math, very simple math, if we take country A, 200,000 kids graduated with diplomas, and country A always think that civil service is where people should be going. The max number of jobs that we create is maybe 10,000. About 180,000, that's the conservative estimate. Those who are 500,000, you all of a sudden see that 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to have some serious issues. So, and bringing it back to the question, governments, maybe there should be a magic bullet, a silver bullet, something that we can throw them all out. We can't do that either. But there's hope. What that is, and let's go back to agriculture. Available land right now. We irrigate less than 3% of our land. We have land. And we know it doesn't rain that much. So that means we have to develop water harvesting technologies. We need to go underground with rivers, and we need to manage the resource very sustainably. Once we have water, then we need to deal with many issues. These are factors of production, simply stated. Better seeds, extension services, private sector, banking, credit availability, women issues, girls issues, and so on and so forth. That's how we are going to attack the root causes. We're going to get into the structure of problems we have. And I think there might be somewhere a sliver of hope, because kids nowadays, they got sick and tired of being poor. They got sick and tired of seeing someone getting a job and all of a sudden R plus 1 plus 2 with a salary of 100,000, 200,000 CFA, which is $300 to $400. There's no way in hell you're going to be able to do that R plus 1 plus 2 years. Which brings us back to what do we need to do? We need to invest in the production sectors. Agriculture, livestock, animal husbandry, fishery, environment. That is where we will make a dent. You know what? Because lack of investment opportunities, that's why we see price spiking because of the Russian invading Ukraine, and all of a sudden 30% of wheat comes from those regions, and those regions are no longer available. So we see the craziness going on in the crisis. Second thing, if you look at the spreadsheet of those, the balance they pay out of these countries, African countries, sub-Saharan Africa, we don't talk about the North African, sub-Saharan Africa. At the minimum, each government sends out, at a minimum, 200 billion CFA, 300 billion CFA. These are very conservative estimates. To buy food, right? But it doesn't make any sense. It's not rocket science. We buy milk, we buy this, and so let's say, I'm saying, with respect to the framework of this coalition in the Sahel, and we need to look people in the eyes and say, buddy, business as usual is not going to look at it. Because why? If kids are frustrated, they join those either terrorists or bandits or what have you. If they run their life extremely difficult. No good. So I'm appealing to all of you who are still hanging tough, hang with the Sahel to say, wait a second, we need to attack the root causes. Because you have not left us yet. You are with us. The coalition, about 60 countries and organizations, as I said earlier, they're all saying Sahel matters to us. Matters to us, why? Because if the security goes bananas out there, then those kids try to look for better ways to go and fall in the sea, or it becomes terrible. You don't want that to happen, because if the Sahel becomes a burning hot spot, we're not going to be able to live easily. So let's get back. Let's invest. Let's cut out the amount of money that goes out to buy food. We need to invest. And it doesn't hurt us to just look at the spreadsheet and say, no, wait a second. Then we need to mobilize the World Bank, the IMF, all the big guns. You say, Mr. President, and that's what I'm saying, that these days we need to invest over and call it on all of you. And a lot of you have strings, you're pulling those strings. So let's all pull it where it makes more sense. We need to bring the business back to invest. Last thing I want to say, there are about 60 to 70% of the mom-and-pop countryside engaged in subsistence type of farming practices, barely producing enough to eat, let alone process, transform, create wealth and jobs. And that must stop. So that's how we get back. Government too will sort of have a breathing room. Everybody's going to be happy, and then we do the issues across the room. And so the time has come that business is doing good. We need to look at somebody in the eye and say, no, this must stop. And I feel there's an opportunity.
Thank you. And so, Dr. Adam Brenia, I'll come to you now. Dr. Adam has talked about investments. So I'd like to ask you, who should be investing? Who should be investing? Who are these actors, and who are the local? Where are the local initiatives, local context, local actors? Where are these sites for investment that actors should be paying attention to, and investment should be drawn into?
Thank you. I think investment first has not been done as it was supposed to be in agricultural sector, but especially in the territories where there is potential development of agriculture. There is potential of irrigation, there is potential concerning livestock, and many products that we don't know about that are existing in the Sahel region. I think you have with you a sample of gum arabic and Mathieu Dandin, who is one of the leader of a company of Arabic, can tell you a bit more about that. But it's a product which is known since so many years and used since so many years in the Sahel. You don't know, but maybe most of you consume it every day when you are consuming soda, cosmetics, and different types of products. So it is in many products which are used here for our daily life. We should also think about the diversity of the products existing in the Sahel in terms of foods. We were talking about proteins. I know we could speak about some specific niébé, for example, which is a type of bean which is growing everywhere in the Sahel, even in very dry lands. But at the same time, we have also to think about. I think there is not enough investment in terms of vocational training, which is very important because, as Dr. Dumais said, there are so many bachelors coming every year but with no job, with no idea of solution behind. And we could train much more young people in vocational education in order to develop agriculture, but also services to agriculture, social services, transformation of the products, and valuing of the products. Then for that, also, there is an investment which has to be done in terms of entrepreneurship. Sahelians and all Africa is really a land of entrepreneurship. There is no more resilient land than the Sahel region, I think, in the world. And I think in that term, there is a lot of capacity to adapt to situation, but not to still to work with the daba, with the tools, not to still make agriculture with hands. We need now to get the right tools to transform agriculture, to produce in good condition, also to reduce insecurity in terms of climate risk, in terms of access to land and equality also for youth and women.
Equality for youth and women. I do want to ask you this, if it's okay. I want us to talk about political solutions in this context, because we painted when we're talking about youth and just in terms of potential and options and opportunities for the region, there is a huge component of solutions that have to be political. So I'd like to ask you, or just hear from you, in terms of the trajectory of the political and democratic consolidation or deconsolidation in the region, the rise of, authoritarianism and all of that democratic backsliding that's going on in the region. What kind of combination of political changes do you think is on the horizon for the region? There's definitely been a change in terms of the amount of demands for accountability from young people. I think the numbers in terms of protest movements in the region, there has been a significant rise. So we know young people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. So what is on the, what's the horizon then for these kinds of changes and all of this kind of movement?
Well, let me distinguish between what I think should happen and what I think will happen. Unfortunately, I think there is a pretty big gap there. I do think that one could envision a government that thought of itself as creating a welcoming environment for investment. Okay, so what do I need to do that? Well, in the first instance, if I want people to invest in agriculture or anything else, there has to be, a measure of law and order. Nobody's going to invest in a place where they think everything's going to be stolen or where their people are going to be kidnapped or whatever it is. So we need law and order. So we'll go, that's a kind of basic thing that I think in many of these countries at this point, there isn't a lot of confidence in the private sector investor community on that basic level. So I'm the government, I'm going to have to figure out how to provide law and order. Then I'm going to have to think about, do I have a labor force that an investor is going to be able to utilize, whether they build on, local education from specialized vocational training. There still has to be local education. I'm not, as an investor, going to come in and teach basic literacy. That has to be something I can assume, right? So now I've agreed that somehow I'm going to provide law and order, and I'm going to provide basic health and education, because otherwise they don't have a labor force that is of any interest to any prospective investor. And finally, and connected to this, particularly the law and order, there has to be a basic infrastructure. If I'm going to have agricultural products coming from somewhere, they have to get somewhere else. They have to get to the capital city, they have to get to wherever I, as the investor, think my market is. So at a minimum, those are sort of three domains in which you would like to see governments encouraged to sort of settle down and say, these are your government responsibilities. We collectively, are going to encourage you to do that. What I see instead, and this is now back to my pessimism, is there's a lot of anxiety on the part of European and generally Western governments that these governments can't do that, so we'll do it, right? So on the rationale of fighting terrorism and countering violent extremism and so forth and so on, a lot of the United States and France and other governments are going in with their own troops to do this, pulling the rug out from the national government, because now the national government doesn't have to do that, or in fact can't do it, because there's already these other military forces. So you've actually made it more difficult for the governments to assume the responsibilities that are going to be necessary as government responsibilities, including law and order. If you're going to go in and say, okay, we're going to take care of the North, we're going to take care of this, there are these dangerous people, and we're going to run around and try and solve that problem because we are worried about whatever we're worried about. So one of the things I think is interesting to me and troubling is that the international community, particularly the Europeans and the Americans here, are actually sort of undermining their own, what they pay lip service to about, stabilizing the capacities of these states by saying, no, we're going to have our own military forces there. So it used to be that, and this is not only in this part of the world, but it's certainly more clear in this part of the world. It used to be that the foreign militaries would work with the local government and try and build the local military capacity. Now they just bypass it. So that means that the local military capacity erodes, just, turns into militias, turns into presidential guards, turns into all sorts of, pretty much, mischievous units. And the capacity to provide general law and order, kind of policing across the country, is pretty much gone. So I would go back and say, I want to talk to the governments that are providing military aid about the way they're doing that. It's not that helpful to provide aid, which is really basically we're going to go in and do it ourselves. So let's step back and think about capacity building again on the military front, on infrastructure, on education and health. Those are the sorts of things that ultimately will create and stabilize governments that can actually provide the, circumstances in which these investors are going to come.
And on the point of capacity building, I do want to ask Jume. I know the coalition is only 3 years old. Could you speak to the diplomatic angle of the work that the coalition does? How does diplomacy in this context intersect with a security approach in a way that you can have more sustainable conflict resolution? So speak to the work that the coalition does in building capacity, building diplomatic relations, bringing consensus, driving collective action. These things take time, and you need institutions around them, you need frameworks around them. So how can we make those approaches intersect better? So you have actors committed to progress and committed in the long-term and sustainable.
How do we get them to intersect? That's a good point. So let me go back, try to pick up from what she said, and then we progressively get into this one. That is, what she said is right. But what is happening now, there is hope. There is real hope, because the coalition, as the head of the coalition, I go in and talk to presidents, the Sahelian president, together their thoughts and their partners, and say, we need a coalition to bring everything under one umbrella. So once that has been done, then basically I go and listen to the presidents. And nowadays, let's say, security issues dominate our region, threats and so on and so forth. We'll get to development shortly. So when we talk about the security-related issues, yes, partners went in, did their part. There are some mixed successes. You can look at them. Is the glass half empty or half full? We're not going to get into that. The mentality shift nowadays for the head of states, and I talked to a lot of them in that region, that we need, the time has come that the African put forward solutions to their problems and then ask the partners to come in and help, i.e., we need to, and I talked to say 6 presidents with respect to security, that we need to put together our forces. 3 things that we need from the international community: logistical support, renseignement, and capacity building for our defense forces. Why? Because it used to be big guns against the guys. The fight has taken on new dimension. The fight is going through our woods, neighborhood, and so on and so forth. You no longer have, a bunch of people sitting there against whom you're going to be sending out the bazookas and what have you. It became more difficult to do that. So basically, Africans said, we need help in logistical support, in technical training, because since the fight has changed, we need to readapt. Guerre asymmetrique, as they say in French. That's one thing. So we are working on that, and I'm doing this tour, and with respect to what the coalition does, as a coalition, I go and talk to those head of states, and put together what we agree upon, that is the need, and then I come and talk to the partnership, this 60+ organization, head of states, and so on and so forth. So this is what the Africans want to do. That's one thing. In terms of politics, back on February 16, we had a dinner at the Élysée. President Macron, President Nadeau, President Bazoum, Chad President, President Talon, and a lot of the Prime Minister, Europeans, all of us in that room. We talked about what worked, what did not work, and what is that we need to do, must do, to re-articulate the strategy in terms of the things that security issues that we deal with. February 17th, there is a declaration called the Declaration de Paris. So they all agreed that night we discussed. The next day there's a declaration. It's a very interesting declaration, which basically says the coalition laid out what the coalition needs to do with respect to its roadmap. That we need to get very busy here with the 4 pillars of the roadmap, fighting terrorism, reinforcing the defense forces, helping the countries to get back and provide goods and services, and build a forest investment, long-term investment for long and sustainable development. And then the second component of that, the Paris Declaration, re-articulating the military interventions in the region. So as a result, Barkhane left Mali and Takuba left Mali. Now we have Barkhane in Niger. Why it's left is because the security issues are no longer just Sahelian, they're also going into the coastal countries. Now what we need to do, and that's what I'm doing, I'm trying to talk to key partners saying the support needed as expressed by the head of state, the time has come now. So hopefully by the time I get back, I'll be here in the US for next Tuesday. I talk to more people, higher up, I talk to enough people, I will talk to more, and that's where the diplomatic. And I also talk to our ambassadors, the 4 ambassadors in Washington, the G5 ambassadors. We had a talk yesterday, we're going to talk again Monday. I take what they bring to the table and we go back and we say, here's what is needed. And I think we're going to be able to change tactics, strategies, put the Africans in the core around which these strategies need to be organized. And I think the time has come to be very specific and objectives, good indicators, good results, because if we do that, then the families, the kids, graduates and what have you, going to say, oh, okay, things are not business as usual. There's some change on the horizon. We might be able to buy some more people, and then if we do get something on the ground, and then I need to get very busy trying to scale up and out what we've been doing so well, and so probably peace and security and diplomacy into the region. And that is, there's a process ongoing right now, and that's very open.
Thank you very much. I know we started a little late, so we don't have a ton of time to really continue with this discussion as much as, you know, there's so many other aspects to explore. So I do have a final question, and I'll just ask you to respond to this just a minute, if you can. In terms of all of these trends that we've spoken about this evening, and the understanding through the picture we painted of the Sahel of today. Could you tell us what you think are the levers for reversing some of these trends? We've spoken on aspects of the political piece, and Remy, spoken around investment, and we've spoken around coalitions and bringing diplomacy and all of these intersections. What other levers, or what concluding levers do you think you'd like to highlight for transformation, or at least some incremental change? Maybe Remy, if you'd like to start.
Thank you. Well, the challenge is so huge, so most of the time we don't know where to start and how it is going to end. So the key question is, how do we want to invest in the territories of the Sahel? The Sahel is not uniform. The problems are common, but it's not a uniform. It's so huge, it's so big. So we have to invest trust into the civil society and its capacity to make the development at its own level, at the level of the territory. And we have also to invest in the supply chains in order to value all the African products and all the Sahel products. I know Pierre is here. I just hear we speak about Fabio maybe later on.
Investing in civil society, investing in building of supply chains. Definitely everybody should speak to here around agricultural, exciting agricultural opportunities around supply chains. Lisa, what levers for incremental change?
I actually love civil society, but that's not where I'm going to place my bets. I'm going to go to African governments developing their own sense of what kind of capacity they need and then saying, this is how you can help us. So in the first instance, I love the idea that there is a sort of beginning of a shift on the military, and not saying it doesn't matter, all outsource if they can take care of it. No, actually that's not right. These governments have to have that capacity under their own control. So I would say, I would like to see, and if it starts in the military sector, the security sector, that's probably a good place to start. But whatever sector it starts in, there really has to be the capacity building in the public sector. Because in the absence of that, civil society isn't civil. There's no way of having people organize themselves in the absence of basic law and order, basic infrastructure, and so forth. So I don't mean to suggest the civil society world shouldn't be doing what they're doing, but so I think that should continue. But there should be a renewed emphasis on the obligations and capacities of governments.
Right now, Mali is red, Burkina is orange/red, Niger is green, but light green. We need to focus on reinforcing Niger's democracy and governance to become darker green. But we have to graduate Niger from the likes of the headaches it has had for so long. There's hope that the democratic process went on. We need to reinforce that. We need to do everything we can to get Burkina out of the jam in which it's finding itself right now. There's a lot out there. We need to do everything we can to get that. And hopefully by July 3rd, it was in Mali, we'll find a consensus so that the junta in Mali too will move forward so we can get Africa back to good governance.
Back to good governance. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so very much, panel. Just a round of applause.